All right, let's dive right into this explainer, because a massive structural catalyst just dropped for first phosphate. Now, if you track critical minerals, you already know that bridging the gap between a promising resource in the ground and an actual operational mine takes serious capital, not to mention a ton of heavy infrastructure. Well, today, we're unpacking a brand new piece of Canadian government funding that attacks this exact hurdle head-on and completely alters the trajectory of their EV battery supply chain roadmap.
So the headline number we're looking at today is a cool $21.5 million. And this is a direct injection of non-dilutive, non-repayable Canadian government funding. Think about that for a second. We're talking about a direct pipeline of capital straight from the federal level, entirely earmarked for powering up critical site infrastructure, and it doesn't dilute the current shareholder base one bit. That is a huge win.
Now, how these funds actually break down is super revealing when you look at the project's strategic roadmap. Back around the time of the PDAC convention in March, the government announced a $16.7 million contribution. And then, just recently, they layered on an additional $4.84 million. So while this all stems from the exact same federal backing, they're targeting two distinctly different phases of the project's development.
To really get why this matters, you have to look at how these two grants work together. It's like a giant puzzle. That initial $16.7 million grant, that's strictly for the heavy engineering work around the concentrator. You know, the actual machine that physically transforms raw rock into high-purity phosphate concentrate. But that new $4.84 million, that is the lifeblood for the machine. It specifically funds the power transmission and road infrastructure, literally powering the concentrator up and ensuring there's a seamless, engineered logistics route to get the final product straight to the market.
Let's zoom in on the actual dirt at the Bégin-Lamarche site for a second, because the logistics here are just incredibly favorable. The main power line and the provincial highway are both less than 2 kilometers away. Because they're sitting right on top of this infrastructure, it's not a question of if they can connect, but how to optimize it. So this specific infrastructure grant is paying for the complex engineering required to figure out exactly how the road will wind and where those transmission lines will go, all while keeping costs down and absolutely minimizing the environmental impact.
And honestly, Tim Hodgson, Canada's Minister of Energy and Natural Resources, really hit the nail on the head here. His perspective perfectly bridges our story from local Canadian dirt roads to a massive national strategy. He points out that Canada is actively building the infrastructure to get these highly sought-after resources out to diverse markets. By tasking First Phosphate with these engineering studies for transmission lines and roads, the federal government is sending a very clear signal. They are aligned, and they see this project as a major domestic priority to get into actual production.
Now, let's zoom back out. You and I know that projects of this massive scale require deep, multi-level support, and First Phosphate has layered this beautifully. Starting right at the foundation, they've been working hand-in-hand with local stakeholders, Indigenous groups, and chambers of commerce. Then, moving up a level, you have the Quebec provincial government, who literally fast-tracked the project by creating a dedicated working group for quicker permitting. Add in that non-dilutive federal infrastructure funding we just talked about, and it all pushes the project up to a global G7 priority status. Everyone is literally pulling in the exact same direction.
Speaking of that global status, things really heated up following Mark Carney's shout-out at the G7 summit in June. The project was officially mentioned by the Prime Minister and placed onto a very exclusive list of priority projects for the G7. From there, the idea spread like wildfire, and First Phosphate attracted a glittering list of international partners. We're talking financial commitments and backing from the broader European Union, and specifically from Denmark, Italy, and Belgium. So we're looking at a localized Canadian project that has secured some incredibly robust multinational buy-in.
To really anchor all of this global interest, First Phosphate recently hit an absolute home run by upgrading their inferred to indicated resources by a staggering 400%. That kind of massive resource validation is exactly what you need to maintain that G7 priority status and feed international demand. Plus, knowing the exact massive scale of this upgraded resource is crucial because it dictates exactly how they need to design and size the roads and power lines being covered by that infrastructure grant.
So why all the intense focus from world leaders? Well, it all ties back to a severe bottleneck in the LFP battery supply chain. North America and Europe are literally starving for the high-purity phosphate required to manufacture lithium-iron-phosphate batteries. And First Phosphate's deposit? It's one of the highest purity sources on the entire planet. They are stepping up to secure a massive vulnerability in the Western world's transition to electric vehicles, which of course makes establishing reliable power and transport infrastructure to this site absolutely essential.
Of course, managing this kind of rapid, massive expansion takes serious cash. But get this, with over $30 million already sitting in their treasury, this new $21.5 million in government grants pushes their accessible capital war chest past the $50 million mark. In the mining sector, capital access is almost always the primary bottleneck, but this funding completely secures the runway for their engineering teams to advance all that infrastructure planning and power integration without the constant dragging friction of having to raise more capital.
What this financial security does is crystallize their operational runway. Since they are fully financed for this phase, they can put their heads down and focus on executing the funded engineering work for their infrastructure. And all of that data feeds straight into their feasibility study, which is targeted for late 2026 or early 2027. That study is the ultimate trigger for the final investment decision, or FID.
But here is the absolute most magical part of this whole structure. What happens post-FID? Typically, companies hit their final investment decision and then they have to scramble to find the cash to actually build the mine. Not here. Those same nation-states we discussed earlier, they are already sitting at the table, perfectly positioned to finance the physical build-out of the concentrator once that FID is reached. The pathway from initial infrastructure engineering to a fully funded operating mine has been systematically, beautifully de-risked.
So we're watching a local Quebec project seamlessly layer indigenous support, provincial fast-tracking, multi-million-dollar federal infrastructure grants, and high-level G7 backing. With the infrastructure engineering fully funded and global partners officially secured, I leave you with this one final thrilling question to ponder. Is North America finally ready to dominate the LFP battery supply chain? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and we will definitely see you next time.